TikTok is powerful and dangerous for the same reasons that Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and Snapchat are dangerous. And that's because they have a massive amount of power over what we see and what information we consume. This is a battle for what the internet will be used for. And in our capitalist system, where we have tech giants, and those tech giants have so much control over us, those tech giants are going to be the big prizes in that fight.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. Every week we look at the big invisible forces that have us in their grasp, and we speak to experts in those forces. TikTok, you guys, is just like any other social media platform. It's just trying to figure out what you want and algorithmically serve you that in an insatiable package, a package you cannot resist. The difference, of course, is it's Chinese-owned. And so in Emily Baker White's book, Every Screen on the Planet, The War Over TikTok, which is out this month, she describes the growth of this company in terms that will be very familiar to American readers. It is a throw spaghetti at the wall, slightly socially awkward and very smart techno-utopian dudes trying to build a system that will predict everyday people's tastes and serve up content they can't get enough of. But the difference, of course, is it's being a Chinese company. And being a Chinese company means it is beholden to all sorts of cultural values and legal problems that don't face other companies. And it also happens to be the very first time that China managed to export a big culture-shaping product to the United States. That's why, at the crossroads of this, you have the CEO of the company, Chu Zhou, both, testifying before senators and hosting the Met Gala on the same trip. What Emily Baker White argues here is that this platform is truly the future of the internet, not just in the sense of the product that it is, but the fight over it is a prediction, is a look into the future at the fight we are all going to have about what we want the internet to be. Is it a free and open place to, gather up ideas and form community? Or is it something that has to be fought over the way that governments fight over land? It's that fight and the very powerful but very careless company at the center of that fight that forms the bulk of this book. And I hope you enjoyed this, what I considered a very interesting hour-long conversation with Emily Baker White. Emily Baker White, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this book really spoke to me on many, many levels. And I have to say that as a journalist, a book like this, on my beat, brings up a certain amount of PTSD, right? Like there's here's the congressional testimony. I remember that day I had to deal with that. And here's this thing. But one thing that I am really astounded by in this is how well sourced you are, and I want to pay homage first to just how hard that is. And maybe you could tell people a little bit about it. I had an NBC person once say to me, when I was first interviewing for the job, we're really well sourced in the Pentagon, but we have trouble, getting into Silicon Valley. And I was trying to explain to that person that it's way harder than the Pentagon. The Pentagon's full of people who are underpaid and hate their boss, but I find tech people to be very hard to get sourced with, because so much of the time they are true believers, they're well paid. It's very, very difficult. So tell me a little bit about, just first of all, how did you get as well sourced on this beat as you did?
It's so interesting that you asked that, and so interesting how you set up the question, because I do think I was one of the first people to sort of go deep within TikTok and start talking to a lot of people. And better than most that often sourcing begets sourcing. If you start down a path and there are other people that have thoughts on a topic and you start writing about that topic, they'll sort of come to you. And I definitely feel like I was the beneficiary of that in a way. I think
when you
people,
just to ask,
yeah.
when you publish a thing,
yeah.
whether it's Forbes or wherever you were working at that time, that tends to set it off. Somebody within that organization reads it and says, "Oh, this is someone I'd like to speak to you about it." Is that right?
Totally. And so just to give an example here. The first story I wrote about TikTok was a story I wrote when I was at BuzzFeed News, and it was about the existence of something called Project Texas. Project Texas was TikTok's sort of internal answer to all of the concerns about it being a national security threat. And the story that I wrote for BuzzFeed, the first one, didn't get a ton of traction. Not that many people read it. It was interesting. It was sort of like, hey, TikTok acknowledges there's this issue and they're trying to move some data around and set up some new protections. But it was after that story that a person approached me and said, oh, actually, I have a lot more information about Project Texas that you're going to be interested in. And I got onto that person's radar because they were like, oh, someone's writing about Project Texas, right? And so I think sometimes when you write a story about a thing, and it's interesting, but it's not, a total bombshell, someone else will come to you and be like, oh, we have so much more to tell you about this thing that can then turn into an entire beat or a run of stories that ends up defining your life.
I have often found that inside the industry, it is a sort of weird kind of almost corrective, mansplaining kind of impulse that brings people out. And maybe you get that more than I do, but people will come to you and say, you got this one a little wrong. Let me tell you, let me sort of clear it up for you. And by virtue of that, you get into a much longer conversation than they probably ever intended.
There's definitely that. You definitely get mansplaining. You definitely get a lot of people who both think they know a lot about a thing and people who actually know a lot about a thing. And sometimes those are the same people, and sometimes they're like half the same people. And so while there are definitely mansplainers, I'm always really eager to hear what people, especially with people with inside information, thought about a story, because if people are eager to tell you their thoughts about that story, they may be eager to tell you about something else that you don't know about that really do want to look into. And so every insider with an opinion about a story is an opportunity as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's get into the book here. So the book is The War Over TikTok, Every Screen on the Planet is the title. And the first passage here that jumped out at me had to do with the sort of psychological origins of the app, of ByteDance specifically, right? So ByteDance, the parent company, for anybody who doesn't know, right, owns many, many companies, TikTok being one of them. And I don't even know that I'm saying this name right. Zhang Yiming, am I right?
That's how I say it. I hope it's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
So founder and CEO of ByteDance. You talk about his early days wanting to create stuff. And you do such a smart job of encapsulating some of the stuff that sort of describes his personality and his attitude toward other people. And I want to read a little tiny bit of it here. So he, for instance, sounds to me like a very quiet, not very social, very cerebral guy who, according to a Chinese language blog that you quote here, he described, he once watched one of the Twilight movies with his family members and dissected it later on social media, studying its psychological effects on its audience. Quote, satisfying the psychological needs of users is user experience, he allegedly posted. And then he told a magazine about his particular psychological needs, which you describe as being different from most people's. Quote, a small number of elites pursue efficiency and realize self-awareness, and they live in reality, he said. He thought most people, this is you writing, he thought most people, though, would fall prey to vice to some degree, whether that meant drinking, gambling, or some other form of indulgence. And what is incredible to me, as someone who is regularly told by a video on TikTok that I should go to bed and stop scrolling, right? That this guy seems to have had in mind this kind of Romulan perspective on human behavior and decided to build a whole industry, a whole corporation out of analyzing that stuff. And yet he seems to take such a dim view of the very behavior that seems to have made his stuff so powerful. Like, talk a little bit about the origin of this place and what you understand about him.
So he's definitely, I would agree, he is a quiet, cerebral guy he has a sort of fascination with delayed gratification. He used to talk and post tons about delayed gratification. Everything was about delayed gratification. And sort of very much a too marshmallow guy. Like, there's all this vice out there in the world, and those of us who are strongest will learn to master it, learn to understand it. And I think, there's definitely an irony here. Like, the person who is so interested in mastering that in himself and sort of analyzing it in the world is also someone who's built something that a lot of people would refer to as an addiction machine, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that that happened. I also don't think he necessarily set out to build something evil or terrible. I think he genuinely believes in, and there's, stuff in the book about this too. He wanted to make it more efficient for information to reach people. And he sort of talked about a reversal between the search paradigm that we've all been living in. You want to know something, you go onto the internet and you search for it. And replacing that with the sort of recommendations paradigm that we've been more recently living in, where you don't know that you want a piece of information, but the algorithm knows enough about you that it knows that you want to see it. And so information looking for people instead of people looking for information, in his mind, was ultimately a sort of higher, more efficient plane of information distribution. And I think that's an interesting and fraught idea.
Yeah. And as you describe and as we were all sort of looking at it in retrospect, they threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. Both he did and people around him, right, to try and capitalize on this.
They still do. ByteDance is famous for throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think that's
interesting.
The scientific method in action here.
That's right. So tell us about the kind of rough draft early stabs at trying to capture this kind of user behavior, and then let's talk a little bit about the current culture of spaghetti throwing.
Yeah, so talking to staff about this is super funny. They're always they would sort of say, "Oh my God, then they launched this thing, and then they launched that thing," and some of them would last like 3 weeks. It wouldn't like. One that sticks out to me is for a very brief period they had an app called LARF, which was an abbreviation, laugh at really funny, and it was just like sort of random memes that like went viral. And this is not something that was around for more than a couple months. It never really got traction, but it was yet another app through which they could deliver some genre of content to people that like might catch on.
Yeah.
And they were very willing.
That doesn't sound that far from TikTok. Like that's in the ballpark.
Yes,
right.
that's in the ballpark. They also, of course, acquired both Flipagram and Musical.ly, two lip syncing apps that were popular in the United States, and then they ultimately sort of retooled Musical.ly and relaunched it as TikTok. But they tried all kinds of things. There was a trivia, like an HQ trivia type of thing within the early TikTok or maybe that was within Top Buzz for a while. There was something called Buzz Video. Again, this was virally entertaining, mostly video, short video content. They did have text-based apps, sort of Twitter clones too, but they had the video and they just needed to disseminate it in a way that it was going to catch on. And they sort of tried a lot of permutations of doing that before TikTok ultimately stuck.
I feel like it's in the kind of rewritten history of a lot of these companies that there was this sort of foregone conclusion that somehow it would work, or that, we had a master plan and we executed that plan. But what you've described here is a place that was, it turns out all these people kind of backed into their success. But this place almost more than most. They just kept throwing spaghetti until something stuck.
Yeah, backed into or just like brute forced into. I don't know if this is one of your next questions, but when we talk about how they actually acquired users, they spent a whole lot of money on advertising. They spent a whole lot of money to acquire users. And in fact, the purchases of Flipagram and Musical.ly were largely user acquisition purchases, right? The benefit of buying these apps and then sort of retooling them as TikTok is that people already had the apps on their phones. They already knew the apps. They trusted the apps. They had like networks on the apps. And so it's really hard to come in as a new Chinese company and say, hi, you want to download our app. It's much easier to acquire an app they're already using and then sort of make it into whatever it is you want to make it.
Yeah, right. You then talk about in that process there being a moment where, as they try to move into new territories, like in this case South America, they're in a place where they have to create the impression that they are the zeitgeist, that they are just the raw feed of what everyone is interested in and what's hot and what's not. But as you point out, there are specific people, a team in this case of like a handful of people, making the early decisions about what's going to work and what's hot and what's not. And you actually refer to it as, I think it's actually called heating, right? That you
Yes.
heat content to make it
Yes.
go. And you actually name for Latin American users a guy named Jorge. Tell us that story about like how it just, because again, it feels like it's this sort of natural zeitgeist
Right.
progression, but it's a totally engineered experience. And you really land on like the names of some of the people who are doing this. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so a note on heating. That's actually TikTok's internal name for that tool. That's not a thing I called it. That's a thing that they called it, which was just really fun when I learned about it, because it's there's a little button, there's a little fire, and you can heat the content, and it's just like it's very easy for those of us who don't work at TikTok to understand how that would work. To talk a little bit about Jorge, and there were many others like him sort of across the world. He was a young, hip, cool guy who was sort of, internet forward, understood what people liked to see on the internet. And he was hired by ByteDance as a curator, like many people were in the United States and, the Middle East and North Africa, everywhere, to help ByteDance to help TikTok figure out what to promote to users. And his most important student, as I say it in the book, was the algorithm itself, right? Because it's hard to imagine now, but initially the TikTok algorithm was kind of janky.
Sure.
It would serve you videos that are 2 seconds long. It would serve you videos that are really blurry. It would serve you videos that are in a dialect that you can't understand, right? And that was a bad user experience. And people would this isn't a good app. I don't like what's on this app, right? Whereas if you had local curators deciding, oh, this is really funny, oh, this is, particularly weird and appeals to this group of people, and I don't think you totally have to overthink it. This is about to be the song of the summer. Let's go here, right? You had people who were culturally competent, who understood the user base for their area, helping figure out what was gonna pop off in their area. And this wasn't super controversial content. It wasn't controversial content at all. It was a funny cooking video. When you think about the guy riding the skateboard with the juice, right? There are these virally gripping, funny things. And we often think about those as things that were magically discovered by the algorithm. And some of them were. But a lot of them weren't. A lot of them were a 23-year-old curator sitting in an office being like, oh my God, this one, right? And then that person gives something a little juice. Say that person gives 10 things a little juice, and then 3 of them then get a lot of organic engagement on top of that, right? And yeah, I talk about this speech given by a former FTC commissioner in the book, where she talks about algorithms. And she says that when someone says algorithm, just take the word algorithm out and replace it with a guy named Bob. Because algorithms are made by humans. They're made by humans to reflect what humans want to have happen. And so if a human shouldn't be doing it, if it's shady for a human to do it, then it's shady for an algorithm to do it. And I think that's additionally useful when we think about these curators who were training the TikTok algorithm. The TikTok algorithm isn't some magic thing that was just born. A bunch of humans decided to tweak it in all kinds of ways to make it stickier, to make it more interesting, right? And it is the product of human decisions. And I think it's just with something that feels as magic as TikTok, it's extra important for us to say, yeah, okay, that's the amalgamation of a lot of intelligent humans thinking about how to make this thing work.
When we come back, we're going to talk about what makes TikTok special in geopolitical terms, and that has to do with it being a specifically Chinese company. We'll talk about that. Stay with us. China is, of course, the distinguishing characteristic of this platform. Aside from its, everything that you have described about it so far, the algorithmic power of it, the fact that it's an engineered thing, that it's preying on human instincts, all of these things, you could say, and others have, of many social media algorithms. But one of the big differences here, of course, is this is a Chinese company. So help us understand, contextualize that for us. What is it like to build a company in China? And what implications are there for you when you become a global powerhouse like TikTok has?
Yeah. So I think the people who built TikTok, I think Zhang Yiming, they're not so different from your Mark Zuckerbergs and your, whoever else, Elon Musk's even. They are techno optimists. They're really smart guys. They're really interested in, building the next technological thing, and they're gonna try to do that. When you get really successful in China, though, of course, China is not a democratic system, right? And the government has a lot of power and a lot of arbitrary power over companies. And so it's not quite like in the United States when you sort of know what the rules are and you follow the rules and you're fine. Because the rules can change at any moment, or the government can just decide that it really doesn't like you or doesn't like something you're doing or thinks you have amassed too much power. And when it does that, it will smack you down and say that some number of your operations are illegal for some reason. And that sucks a lot if you're an entrepreneur. You're like just trying to live your life. You're trying to live within the rules, right? You probably, like most of us in most jurisdictions, find the government annoying sometimes. But like, at least when we find the government annoying here, we mostly kind of know what the rules are. And not having clarity on what the rules are is really hard as an entrepreneur in China. And another thing that became really hard for companies sort of over the course of TikTok's life was a big tightening, certainly over ByteDance's life, a big tightening of government control over private companies in general. And so in 2017, the government of China passes a law that says that says that the government can force any Chinese citizen or Chinese company to spy on behalf of the government at any time. This law gets a lot of play among like hawks in the U.S. government, talking about why TikTok or why other Chinese companies are a threat. Talking to experts about it, it's not clear how much it actually changed for Chinese companies because that sort of undercurrent of government leverage was kind of there already. And writing it down didn't necessarily make it worse, but it certainly made it worse for other governments because other governments then had something to point to and say, literally, you can conscript any random private company or citizen at any time. We can't trust those people anymore. And that's essentially what happened to TikTok and what happened to a number of other Chinese companies that, like, irrespective of whether Zhang Yiming wanted this to happen, all signs say he didn't, all of a sudden, governments around the world look at Chinese law. They look at the fact that, ByteDance is a Chinese company and they say, well, they can be forced to spy for the Chinese government at any time. That's not great. We have concerns. And that's kind of reasonable on behalf of the other governments, but it also is a huge bummer for Zhang Yiming and the other people who didn't ask for this to happen to them, right? And there's not evidence that the Chinese government has ordered TikTok to turn over X, Y, or Z information or to sow propaganda. And they're likely, if they did that, they wouldn't want there to be evidence. And so there are a lot of people at TikTok and at ByteDance saying, like, this is a theoretical problem. Right. And it is a theoretical problem, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem, right? And so that sort of became the big concern for people in the United States and elsewhere around the world about TikTok.
Just to contextualize it, right, prior to that 2017 law, I mean, during the Obama administration, I remember the rhetoric around China was very much that this place is becoming more and more America-like in its innovation industry. And you had guys like Jack Ma and Pony Ma and these huge CEOs rising and rising and rising. Some of the biggest banks in the world are in China because there was so much incredible underwriting going on. And it just felt to me like, wow, we're on a path to truly a sort of, this neoliberal global order is going to happen. And then, I remember when Jack Ma got, do we call it arrested? I mean, he definitely got sort of disappeared by Xi Jinping's government for a little bit, right? Yeah. And there was this incredible tightening. What do you remember about that time? Like, I just remember this shift that for me was like, oh, this is not going the way I thought it was going to go.
Yeah, I mean, and if your people at TikTok watched that moment and said, whoa, yikes, right? And so I think not just at TikTok, but people at all Chinese companies, certainly a lot of, entrepreneurs in China looked at that moment and said, wow, I don't want that to be me. And that was kind of the point of doing it, right? Like they made an example out of Jack Ma. We still don't know exactly what happened when Jack Ma disappeared. But we do know that it scared the crap out of a lot of people.
Him.
Nope,
Yeah,
no, he's back.
Yeah, he's out in the
he's
world
definitely
now, but
back.
he's now talking about what happened, and we don't know. That's right.
Correct. And
right.
so I think in autocratic states, often sort of mysterious disappearances are used as a way to try to chill dissent from others. And I think that was an example of that for sure.
And it's such an interesting sort of historical coincidence that you have this moment when TikTok is ascendant and becoming truly the first great Chinese export, a true global powerhouse media play. First time in certainly American history that's been true. We've had, some British shows take off, and we watched a lot of Korean TV, but like to see something in which, what are the numbers? It's crazy. It's like, half of U.S. teens were on it daily or something crazy. I mean, to have a Chinese company plugged into the American psyche as strongly as it was, to have that success taking place at the same moment that Xi Jinping, in theory, is trying to crack down on free market activity in tech in China is such a crazy conflagration of things happening.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's complicated for Xi Jinping and for the Chinese government to sort of figure out how to play it, right? There have been several times in TikTok's history that the Chinese government has wanted to crack down on tech companies. They say tech companies are amassing too much power. We're really not comfortable with this. We just need to smack them all down, right? And the Chinese government wants to smack them all down and wants to make sure that they don't get too powerful. It also really likes the idea of having a massively successful international export and the idea that it can have some leverage over this incredibly powerful technological tool. And I think figuring out how to have both those things at the same time has been and continues to be tricky for the Chinese government.
So one of the things that, of course, made headlines in your career was that you and a British journalist were at the same time surveilled, or your information was pulled, it turns out, by people inside TikTok. And the sort of the casual observer would look at that and think, oh, this is, of course, a function of its being, a part of the Chinese surveillance apparatus. But what I thought was so interesting in your book is just how it turned out that was not actually, there was no evidence that this was actually a government surveillance effort. It was something else entirely. Tell us that episode. Tell us the story of that episode.
It was a massive unforced error, is what I'll say about it. So I'll tell my story. Christina Kirtle at the Financial Times is the other person who was surveilled, and you should ask her to tell her own. I'll do my best to explain what happened to her too. But what happened to me is that I wrote that little story at BuzzFeed News that, didn't get that much attention. And then a person came to me and said, you want to talk about Project Texas? I've got way more on Project Texas. I've got a whole trove of internal audio recordings. And this was a person who had worked at TikTok and had recorded more than 80 internal meetings about Project Texas. Very exciting day when you're a journalist and someone tells you they want to leak you 80 internal audio tapes about the company you're covering. I've
worked in this business a long time. I have never had anybody come to me and say, I've got 80 hours of audio recordings I'd like to send you. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And then you get really paranoid and you're like, well, are they fake? Are half of them fake? How do I make sure that everything in here actually happened? And so you go to other sources. And what happens after that moment is actually journalistically quite complex. But eventually, after corroborating many details across, I realized that they were real. And I wrote a much bigger story about Project Texas after that. And what the bigger story essentially revealed was that TikTok was trying to solve this problem of the fact that US user data, at that time at least, was accessible to many, many, many people in China. And that wasn't some nefarious plot. That was just the way the app had been built. It had been built by people in China. There are all of these internal data pathways. Again, not nefarious, just the way big apps work. And data was...
Is that bad for optics, or is that legally bad in the United States?
At the moment it was happening, it was certainly bad for optics. I don't think it violated any laws.
But it definitely didn't. They didn't want to have to tell anybody, "Hey, we are
No.
your information's flowing into Chinese servers."
Yes.
Nobody wanted to hear
Yes.
that.
Chinese servers is a little bit complicated. It
sure.
wasn't exactly flowing into Chinese servers, but it was accessible by people in China, many of them.
Got it.
And so I write this big story about basically TikTok's effort to change this, but in their effort to change it was a sort of massive taking stock of the problem. And they had like consultants from Booz Allen Hamilton who were out there like trying to solve this problem. They had hundreds of people inside the company working on this, and I heard a lot of them on audio talk about the problems and what you would need to do to fix them. So I write this big story. TikTok, ByteDance, justifiably kind of freak out after that. Someone has recorded all these internal meetings. They've leaked them to a journalist. They've got a lot of members of Congress really angry at them. And so they start investigating leaks internally. And in the course of investigating leaks internally, members of the Internal Audit and Risk Control Department, which no longer exists, decided, here's what we're going to do. If we just take Emily's TikTok account and we look at all the IP addresses from which it has pinged, and then we compare those IP addresses to the IP addresses of everyone who works at our company, because they have that data, we can see if any of our employees were in the same Starbucks or at the same park or pinging from the same physical place. And then we'll know who's leaking.
So literally they wanted to spy on your movements and the movements of employees to see where they overlapped.
Yes, that was the idea. These people carry out this data pull to try to cross-reference data. Among those people are some who were physically located in China. And that's relevant because it means that my data about where I physically was accessed from China. And they don't really get anywhere. But I find out that this has happened. Sources inside the company tell me this has happened. I figure out it's happened. And so I write a story. And my first story is very vague. What I actually knew was that there was a plan to do it. I didn't know that it had been done, but I knew that there was a plan. So I write that story. And I don't say who it is that there was a plan to surveil. I just say American citizens, because that's what I knew at the time. I knew there was a plan to surveil more than one American citizen. The other people there being several colleagues of mine at Forbes. And to protect a source, we weren't that specific. TikTok and ByteDance totally deny that this happened. They impugn our integrity on Twitter. They
before an hour. This is so people understand the machinations of how this works. You send the sort of the facts of the story to them for comment before publication, and as is always the case in tech companies, they hold off on responding until the very last moment, and in doing so, they then plop down a blog post.
This is for the other story, though. This is
the other story? Or do I have this wrong? Oh, okay.
Only very slightly. That's what happened when we went to them for comment on the tapes. What I'm talking about now is once we go to them with the surveillance details.
Do they try to vague. do they deny
they
it?
Came back with some stuff. They did. Well, they came back and said, we don't use GPS data, so obviously that's impossible. And I'm like, I didn't ask about GPS data. I asked about IP data. But then
because they can deny that GPS data might
my guess is that the exact people responding to that comment request did not fully know exactly what was going on at the company. And one reason I believe that is because after I wrote the story, they brought in Covington, formerly Covington and Burling, a very fancy white shoe law firm that does internal investigations, and said, can you figure out why she reported that this thing happened? And Covington presumably goes and interviews a bunch of people internally, gets access to a bunch of internal documents, and says, okay, yeah, actually, we did do this. We did it twice. We did it with Emily, and we did it with this other journalist, Christina Criddle. And as one does when one does not want a lot of people to read what just happened 2 days before Christmas, 3 days before Christmas, they have a mea culpa, and they come out and say, this happened, right? And they acknowledge that it happened. They fired the people who did it. And they said, this was a massive screw up. We're really sorry. And we have taken lots of actions to make sure that it won't happen again.
Massive screw up is a theme we're returning to again and again here. There is a real portrait of what is less sort of deliberate scheming and a lot more kind of careless behavior. And we're going to get deeper into that when we come back. Stay with us. Over and over and over again, the events in the book depict what I would just describe as just carelessness. Maybe not even individual carelessness as much as just an inability as an organization to make a plan from on high and stick with it. It just feels like an incredibly iterative and experimental environment. And as a result, that worked pretty well when it came to developing, a thing that would reflect the zeitgeist and be compelling as a user experience. But boy, in dealing with you as a journalist and the scrutiny of senators and everything else, boy, it seemed to get them into trouble.
So one person who worked there said to me that they thought the company and the people who worked for the company were messy, not malicious. And I think that's like pretty good. I think that's what you were saying. And it feels true. I did not hear a lot of stories about people acting with malice or with sort of geopolitical intent. But again, this is a tech giant we're talking about. We could think of other tech giants that have also, in pursuit of wild growth, cast aside concerns about safety. You see them do it to this day. Like basically all of them have to make these trade-offs between safety and profit, safety and growth, safety and speed of growth. And tech companies do not, as a group, have a great track record there. And I think we're seeing that. The other thing to know is that TikTok just grew so fast. It grew faster than Instagram. It grew faster than TikTok.
So
and
tell us more about that.
Fast
right.
breeds chaos internally. And like when you think about Facebook's move fast and break things, right? Facebook did move fast. It did break a lot of things. TikTok moved faster and arguably has like broken, certainly internally, every little bit as much. There are people doing duplicative work, and then those people have to get laid off. And whoops, we laid off someone we shouldn't have laid off, and now we need to rebuild this thing. There's a ton of like turnover at this company because people are expected to work very long hours. They're expected to work like all hours of the day and night because they're working across time zones. And when you get a ton of turnover, first of all, you lose a lot of institutional memory. Second of all, you just waste a lot of time redoing things that were half done and then abandoned. And it is really, really messy internally. It was. Often entities mature and slow down a little bit. My hunch is TikTok has a ways to go before it can really mature and settle down, but hopefully it's trending that direction. But like absolutely, this is a chaotic environment. And to turn back to the geopolitical question and problem here, since that is sort of the crux of why people are worried about TikTok. One way I sort of explain the 2017 national security law is by calling or identifying something called the employee shakedown problem, which is basically if you have an employee in China who has access to data that could be valuable to the CCP, the username and direct messages of a dissident or something. A Chinese policeman can come to your house, put a gun to your head, and say, you're going to give me that data or I'm going to disappear you or your grandma or your best friend just because I say so. And the Chinese government absolutely does that type of thing. And so if any person in China has the ability to either pull data from TikTok for the Chinese government, like the type of sort of private data about Americans that they might care about, or if they have the ability to tweak the algorithm in an interesting way to, first of all, access to the heating button, right? Can you just sort of heat this propaganda for us over here? Great, good. If you don't, I'm disappearing your dad, right? Like that kind of leverage is very scary. And that kind of leverage is much of what the US government was worried about with TikTok and ByteDance. And so I think when we think about how messy TikTok is, messy, not malicious, like messy begets opportunity for like one little guy over here with malice to be able to carry out a scheme. And I'm not here to say that that's happened, but I am here to say that when something is that messy and that big and that sort of prone to mistakes, you worry about the person with malice who might act very quietly just to exploit some of that mess.
Yeah, right. What's interesting is that there then sort of was this moment where this, as you've described it, this very messy organization suddenly has to put on a very adult face and try to placate American senators. I remember Shushu, the CEO, current CEO of TikTok, had this little like run of appearances in the United States where he was like talking to senators, and then he was like hosting the Met Gala. Like there was this contrast, I remember, between his need to sort of present a responsible face to American lawmakers, and at the same time, he's here as clearly the sort of hottest media person in the world, and that's why he's in charge of this like hot photo op, Met Gala. And I just remember thinking about that contrast and how complicated that was. So tell us a little bit about this. You have a chapter called the Show, I think it's called, which is his
Showtime.
Showtime. Thank you. Showtime.
So his name is pronounced Show, and he uses his handle Showtime as a way to sort of teach people that. But he loves the performance. He loves the show. And the chapter called Showtime is actually about that hearing, right? And like that hearing was his debut to many people, right? He knew that it was going to go viral. He knew that it was going to be a big thing. And largely, he did really well, actually, because U.S. tech hearings are kind of clowny sometimes. U.S. lawmakers do not always put their best foot forward.
I remember, though, that one being more sophisticated than I had seen previously. Now, was it sophisticated? I'm sure I don't think we could call it that. But I remember it being so much more sophisticated than I'd heard in the past. It's still performative, and people are going on long speeches and asking questions that aren't really questions and so forth. But I remember the senators there talking about the power of social media to manipulate, and talking about the dangers to children and so forth in a way that I had never heard them talk about it when it came to American social media and American companies.
I think it's really funny because at its core, TikTok is powerful and dangerous for the same reasons that Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and Snapchat are dangerous. And that's because they have a massive amount of power over what we see and what information we consume. And because they know so much about us, right? And for years, we've been having a conversation about that and about whether we should be worried about that and whether we should be worried about the decisions that they're making with all that data and all that control over our discourse. And Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, came forward and sort of said, we need to change this. And a bunch of people, I would say mostly on the center left, said, wow, yeah, that's a problem. We need to work on this. And then TikTok came along, and a bunch of people, mostly on the center right, said, yo, this is really scary. Like, this is a platform with a huge amount of power, a huge amount of data, and it all comes down to who you trust, right? Mm-hmm. Frances Haugen was talking to a bunch of people who didn't trust Mark Zuckerberg that much. And then the people who were raising the alarm about TikTok were not that trusting of ByteDance because they weren't that trusting of the amount of leverage that the Chinese government had over ByteDance. And I recognize both those as reasonable concerns, right? You have these platforms that have massive amounts of power, and then you have someone at the top, and often you have someone who has leverage over that someone at the top. And how decisions are made at these companies that have so much power over us is a really important question. And I feel like finally now lawmakers are sort of starting to coalesce around that and to realize that they've sort of been talking about the same thing. They've just been talking past each other because they don't necessarily distrust the same people. I mean, look at Elon Musk and X. A lot of people now very much don't trust Elon Musk to run X, right? Reasonably so. We've got like Mecha Hitler bot over here. Mm-hmm. And so those people, the fundamental problem is that they don't trust the person at the top. And with all of these tech companies, do we really want to give like one person or a person over whom a government has a lot of leverage that much power over us?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned at one point sort of the political tides and sort of where you've described in several places where the political tides sort of turn toward and against TikTok. And at one point you described Jamal Bowman, the Democrat, being one of the few people that was sort of willing to defend TikTok, and he gives public remarks in which he basically makes the point that you've just made, which is this, that if we're going to look at TikTok, we got to look at all these companies, and we don't have a national privacy law in this country when it comes to data, and pointing all that stuff out. And to my mind, there was this brief moment when, and I'm curious if you think this is right. Like, was there a moment when the tide could have turned TikTok's way, and in the end, why do you think it is more politically expedient to be anti-TikTok than to be for it?
I think Jamal Bowman had a good point that we should look at all of them, and that a lot of the concerns we have about TikTok we do or should have about other platforms. I think that didn't mean for a lot of people for a lot of lawmakers that they shouldn't act on TikTok while they could. I really hope that we get a national data privacy law in this country sometime soon, but I think the reason we haven't, it's real. Guys, we're behind everybody else. Let's get there. But I think the reason that we haven't is, first of all, the tech lobby is huge and powerful. But second of all, I think there are a lot of questions about what should be covered and what shouldn't be covered and how it should work. And the reason that Congress was able to come together on TikTok was because they made the law so narrow. Nobody liked TikTok. Everybody was comfortable hating on TikTok. Everybody had concerns about TikTok. And they were able to scope them in a way that was narrow enough. The law doesn't just cover TikTok, but TikTok was the big one that was going to be covered in the near future. And scoping a law really narrowly, where you have broad bipartisan consensus, gives it a chance of passing in a way that a bigger piece of legislation like a national data privacy law is just a lot harder. And I think they did the TikTok thing narrow and quick because they could.
Yeah, right. I think that's so interesting, because that was the vibe I had, is this has raised so many of the big issues we have in this country around surveillance capitalism. And yet we couldn't get our act together on the bigger issues. We could only get our act together around this one thing. And whether that's because there's a little frisson of xenophobia there, whether it's because it's just around one company, whether
the war in Gaza played a little role at just bringing a few people over. It's, we're really worried about this. Okay, we're going to do this. There are people who will tell you that TikTok was banned because of the war in Gaza. I don't believe that, but it did play a role. There was that moment in November 2023, I believe, when this is just a few months after October 7th, and you had Osama bin Laden's letter to America go momentarily viral on TikTok. That freaked some lawmakers out. That freaked some centrist lawmakers. They were like, what is happening here? And it was a moment. It wasn't a hugely consequential moment in American politics, but it was the type of thing that just, hint of xenophobia, hint of lack of understanding, but just what the fuck is this? How is this happening? We should ban it. Go ahead. Yeah. What are these kids doing? This is scary. We don't like it. Okay. Right. And I think that moved a few people. And, I think certainly geopolitics heating up in that way. And there was a moment, around the Ukraine war too, when all of a sudden there's all this stuff on TikTok and people were like, we don't really understand how this content is getting served to people, really don't understand why, the discourse about a hot war being in the hands of this faceless algorithm that we don't totally understand that has these connections to China, I think just scared a lot of people.
When we come back, what happens next? Where is TikTok headed? Do we all get to use it? What is its future? Stay with us. So for a brief moment, TikTok is banned. I remember, I'll just to cop to my bona fides here. I that's my main social media. It's where I have the most followers. It's totally, for me, I really had my hopes sort of pinned to breaking through on TikTok, and then it got freaking banned. And I remember being like, I can't believe I'm in the position where I am personally affected by this. I can't just report on it. I felt like I had to sort of cop to it every time I talked about it. Anyway, but then along comes Trump, takes the White House, and flips that ban right off. And you have, the CEO thanking him. It was banned for a second, right? How long did that last? And tell us about how Trump's sort of opinion of it and his interactions with it politically had changed.
Yeah, so a lot of people will say that TikTok wasn't even really banned, that there was just a little flickery stunt that happened. TikTok did go down for a number of hours, but the Biden administration had told it beforehand, we're not going to enforce this law. That's on the next guy. This is like, you don't need to turn the thing off. Like, everyone had made clear that they didn't have to turn it off. But they decided to turn it off because they thought it was politically expedient to do so. And so...
Right, because they're handing Trump this enormous political gift of making it look as if the Biden administration had banned it and Trump had turned it back on.
So to rewind a little bit, April 2024, Congress passes a law and Biden signs a law saying that TikTok must be sold within 270 days or it'll be banned. The deadline, coincidentally, for the sale is the day before the next president's inauguration. At this point, we don't know who that's going to be. Trump is reelected. Before he's reelected, he joins TikTok. He starts saying, oh, I wouldn't ban TikTok. That's this unpopular thing these other people did over here, like my opponent, Joe Biden. I wouldn't ban TikTok. I like TikTok. TikTok is great. The youth love TikTok. And so Trump positions himself as all of a sudden this pro-TikTok candidate. Kind of savvy, given that the ban went through overwhelmingly in Washington, but young people don't like it. A lot of people don't like it. And then Trump wins. And TikTok starts saying, all right. And they're fighting the ban in the courts, right? As soon as the ban goes into place, TikTok fights the ban in the courts. They lose big in the DC circuit, and they appeal to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court does not take most appeals they get, but they do take this one. And so going into January, right before Trump comes back to power, they rush a decision at the Supreme Court, and TikTok loses 9-0. And TikTok's only last hope, there is this law. It is passed. It is constitutional, 9-0 in the Supreme Court. Their only hope is that Trump will tell his DOJ to ignore the law. And so they suck up to Trump. They do this flicker. They send a series of in-app messages saying, we're working with President Trump to make this all okay. Thank you so much to President Trump. Show makes a video and posts it to TikTok that I think in the book I describe as like a slightly shaky hostage video. If the hostage was like held at the Four Seasons. He just like looks very anxious, and he's got this like fancy crown molding behind him. But thank you so much to President Trump. Everything's going to be okay because he's such a good president. Like, he didn't quite say that, but there was definitely a supplicating vibe there. And Trump says, yeah, okay, we're going to ignore the law for a while, and then we're going to broker a sale. Trump loves brokering deals. He loves saying he brokered deals. That's his thing. And so Trump starts talking to people who could buy TikTok. And to be clear, it's not exactly clear what they would be buying and what they wouldn't be buying. Because if you think way back to Trump 1.0, Trump said he was going to ban TikTok if it wasn't sold. And then at the last minute, when TikTok was about to be sold, the Chinese government came in and said, yeah, but not the algorithm, right?
Yeah,
which is the thing that makes TikTok run.
Right.
And so this time around, maybe Trump could convince the Chinese government to change their minds. But assuming he can't, we're talking about a sale of some asset that doesn't contain the algorithm. Are we going to build a new algorithm? There was talk that TikTok might try to do that. Are we going to lease the algorithm from ByteDance in China? There was talk about them doing that. Anyway, Trump goes...
There's such an old guy assumption, too, that, like, we'll just replace the phone company with a different phone company, but everyone will continue to use the phone. But the idea that kids are going to suddenly say, oh, sure, yes, sir, we'll just get on whatever the replacement is you come up with is so naive about how internet business works.
Yes. And so Trump says, I'm going to broker a sale of TikTok. They're going to sell TikTok. It's going to be fine. ByteDance is going to sell TikTok. Then they'll be in compliance with the law. The way that Trump grants this extension and the two extensions after it does not have anything to do with the law. It's not following the law. It's very, very clearly not following the law. But presidents have discretion about how laws are enforced or not enforced. There's a long history of that. You know, President Obama didn't enforce like simple drug possession laws. I think it was, Reagan and Bush didn't do all the environmental laws. Like, there's a long history of this. So Trump says, I'm not going to enforce this law while I work it out. The problem basically comes down to whether the Chinese government will allow a sale to go forward. And Trump was apparently very close to fully brokering a deal in April. And then right before that deal was going to go through, he went and announced really aggressive tariffs. The Chinese government got big mad and said, no, you can't have TikTok. Absolutely not. We're not approving any sale at all. And they told ByteDance, you're not going to make any sale at all. ByteDance said, okay, yes, sir. And so, you know, if there is... So where we are right now is TikTok is operating in the United States. It's operating against the law.
Right, on borrowed time, just because the DOJ is not enforcing the law. Right.
Correct. And Trump could decide in the future that he's going to let DOJ enforce the law, and then TikTok would be banned, and TikTok would go offline. TikTok exists on borrowed time due to the grace of Donald Trump right now. And Trump keeps saying, there's going to be a sale, there's going to be a deal, she's going to approve it, I know he is. And if she chooses to approve something, then some deal may go forward. If that happens, she will have decided that it is in his interest, in the interest of the Chinese government, to let that happen. And Trump will have decided that it's in his interest to let that deal happen. And right now, both of those men have pretty much complete control over TikTok, in that either of them could call up TikTok and be like, if you don't do X, I'm going to shut you down. And so we've got two men with huge leverage over TikTok. A deal may go forward if both of them decide, yeah, we want this to happen to this company. If that happens, if a deal does go forward, I'm really curious to see whether either of those men put into the deal some sort of like residual power over TikTok for themselves or their successors. But right now, TikTok exists at the pleasure of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. And some deal might happen in the future, or it might not. Or Trump could change his mind and say, actually, I'm fed up with you, TikTok. I'm going to let my DOJ enforce the ban, and TikTok will go away in the United States.
I want to close here with, and I'm open to anything else you want to talk about, of course, here, but there's an episode that you described at the very beginning of the book that for me is really a powerful one, where during a big gathering of tech people in China, in which China is trying to basically advertise itself as an alternative to the American orthodoxy around tech, a piece of paper is slid under all of these different tech leaders' hotel room doors, saying, you have, by being here, signed on to this declaration of that sort of rejects the American orthodoxy. Let us know by 8 a.m. if you're not part of it, but otherwise we're going to just go forth with this, which is such a, I don't know what I would do if somebody did that. But what all these tech leaders did, right, is they pulled out and did register their objections, and that thing got erased. And I'm just got to, hats off to you. That is great reporting that you know about that, and that you did that as such an interesting thing. And the thing I just want to say about it is, and what leads me to because I want to get your closing thoughts on this is, do you think, like, for me, what the TikTok you describe in this book seems to represent is this moment that I think if somebody from the 19th century came forward and came into the present and had to have the situation explained to them, to look at this world in which there is this competition for psychological access to as many people as possible, and that creating huge money-making opportunities, not to mention geopolitical power. But you can't cross borders with it, it turns out, in quite the way that one might have expected. We are all flesh and blood, but it turns out that it really becomes this geopolitical problem when one country, or at least when another country does it to the United States. We've been doing it to other countries forever. Like for you, how do you describe to people the big takeaways of all these years covering this company?
Yeah, so I think like the concept here, the way that they talk about it in law and policy, is the idea of digital sovereignty. And the way I think about it is who owns the rules of the internet wherever you are. And the Chinese government in that declaration that ended up getting nixed wanted to say, wherever you are, the internet is going to have those rules. If you're in China, the internet is going to have China's rules. If you're in the United States, the internet is going to have US rules. And that is more true today than it was back then. But I think there was a moment in the early internet where the internet was jurisdictionless. It wasn't American or Chinese. It was a place where a bunch of people went and they published things and they could read things that other people from other, jurisdictions wanted to say. And there really was a sort of radical free speech to it. And now there are all sorts of efforts to control speech online and to control distribution of that speech online. And I have this line at the end of the opening there where I say, like, people created these massively powerful tools to surveil and propagandize. Of course the strong men were going to come and try to control them, right? Of course those people were going to come and try to harness that for themselves. And we don't necessarily think of the internet as primarily a surveillance machine or a propaganda machine. It's also an amazing machine of free speech and expression and democratization. But it can be all those things. It is all those things at the same time. And forces for democracy, democratization, free speech, free expression, free press are going to use the internet as best they can to advance their aims. And the people who believe the absolute opposite are going to try to use it that way too. And so this is a battle for what the internet will be used for. And in our capitalist system, where we have tech giants, and those tech giants have so much control over us, those tech giants are going to be the big prizes in that fight. Whether, between sort of authoritarian aims and democratic aims on the internet. And that's, to me, what the TikTok conversation is about.
Emily Baker-White, the book is Every Screen on the Planet, The War Over TikTok. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.